Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was there alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from the land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the water. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." "Lord, if it is you," Peter replied, "tell me to come to you on the water." "Come," he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came towards Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. When those that were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." When they had crossed over, they landed at Gennesaret, or however you say that. And when the men of that place recognized Jesus, they sent word to all the surrounding country. People brought all their sick to him and begged him to let the sick just touch the edge of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed.
Thank you. So do you ever have those moments where you're giving advice to someone and then you think, that was really good advice. I wish that I listened to my own advice more often. Just me. I was thinking about this week. Any wisdom I often impart, it's normally something I've nicked from the Bible, and mostly if it's difficult, I've nicked it from Jesus. The classic thing of don't give advice, ask a question, because Jesus does it all the time. But it got me thinking about why if I do that, don't I always listen to the advice that would come from Jesus? Why am I not more like Jesus? And this morning we're on part 3 of our More Like Jesus series. And today we're looking at not necessarily a characteristic of Jesus that we need to take on, but more just looking at Jesus. I've literally changed my career path, I think it's 3 times, because of Jesus. The most expensive thing we ever bought was because Jesus said we needed to move to Epsom and start loving our neighbours. In fact, we've planted this church because of that too. It's pretty major. I married Lorna just because she had a great relationship with Jesus. I was attracted to it. Jesus is attractive, and he's attractive in us as well. So this morning, I want to look at how we find our confidence in Jesus, and indeed why we find our confidence in Jesus. But before we start, I've got a little, for those of you who are new, I do apologise. We often have a little moment to ponder in each of our sermons. So today's the same. So can you turn to a person you're sat next to or near to and tell them about a person that you admire because they have confidence in Jesus? Can you think of a person? Can you pop that up on the screen, Mike? Can you think of a person that you admire because of their confidence in Jesus, and just share it with the person next to you? I'm hoping it won't take too long. I'll give you 2 minutes to chat to the person next to you. There you go. Thank you. So, with Jesus, he's different from everyone else who ever lived because he was uniquely expected. No other person was anticipated for as long as Jesus was anticipated for. Me, I was anticipated for about 9 months. I came out a little bit late, so 9 months and 2 weeks. But when God's people were waiting for Jesus, they literally waited for centuries. Many of us have watched the Star Wars films or the Matrix films. That all these film franchises have a central character who is basically the Messiah character. Luke Skywalker, the Jedi who overcomes the evil empire. Neo from the Matrix, kind of a reluctant savior who breaks the power of control over our lives. I could go on. If you're as old as me, John Connor in The Terminator, humanity overcoming the machines. Frodo Baggins, probably the favourite one. From Lord of the Rings, a humble servant, faithful, wise, and selfless. All these characters are born from the story of Jesus, this idea of a Messiah. Imagine those films without a Messiah character. They just wouldn't exist. For Jesus, there was prophetic statements about his messiahship from the Old Testament, which are fulfilled in his life. Details about his birth, his ancestry, his ministry, the conflict and opposition he would face, all there. That he would be born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin, taken to and come out of Egypt. He would be the offspring of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, of the tribe of Judah, a direct descendant of King David, and that a messenger would prepare the way for him in John the Baptist. He would be a light to those in darkness. He would give sight to the blind, proclaim justice, heal the sick, cleanse the temple, and be rejected. And that's less than half of them. And all those prophecies were written at least 400 years before Jesus was actually born. It's fascinating. Well, it was fascinating to me. So imagine how excited God's people would be when Jesus was finally born, the Messiah they've been waiting for literally centuries. Hopefully that gives us a little sense of why we should have some confidence in Jesus. But if that wasn't enough, as you then go through his life, he was undeniably human. He's recorded as experiencing hunger in Luke 4:2, thirst in John 19:28. He sleeps in Luke 8:23, has weariness in John 4:6, has sorrow in Matthew 26:37. And as Hebrews talks about, he knows what it was to be human, to be tempted and tried. We read, we do not have a high priest alluding to Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in every way. Basically, Jesus can empathize with anything that we struggle with as humans. Being human, he experienced death, so when if you're squeamish, you might need to put your fingers in your ears in a minute. But in John 19:33, we read that when the soldiers came to Jesus on the cross, they found he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. They didn't break his legs, but they did pierce his side. And then, curiously, it's written that blood and water flowed out of his side. They probably didn't understand this medically at the time, but this is the squeamish bit, and I do apologise. Before he was nailed to a cross, he would have been flogged. 39 lashes with a Roman whip called a flagrum, which was basically horrible. The loss of blood and low blood pressure that would have brought would have led to a hypovolemic shock. The heart races to pump blood that isn't there. Low blood pressure can cause the victim to collapse, as Jesus did. The kidneys shut down, preserve bodily fluids, and that sustained rapid heartbeat causes the hypovolemic shock. And it also causes liquid to gather on the heart and lungs, which is probably what we see in that passage. So we also can have confidence, not just because confidence in Jesus, not because he was prophesied about, but because he was undeniably human. His traits were incredibly human, just as ours are. But he was also a real historical figure. If you've ever done the Alpha course, it's brilliant at running through some of the historical documents about Jesus. There are many people that wrote about him that aren't from the Bible. So I'm going to pronounce these terribly wrong, I'm sure, but Tacitus, Suetonius, the Roman satirist Lucian of Samosata, the Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who most people know as Josephus, Tertullian of Carthage, Thallus, a Samaritan, recorded as writing in about 52 AD. So he wrote about when Jesus died on the cross, it says the curtain in the temple was torn in two and darkness fell on the land. So he was trying to explain it as an eclipse. So he's Samaritan, he's not Jewish, he's not a Christ follower. Pliny Secundus, obviously a Roman, was governor of Bithynia in Asia Minor, about the turn of the 1st century. And he started writing about the Christians, and he was asking the emperor at the time how to treat the Christians. He wanted some input. So not only Jesus was well documented, but his followers were well documented too. There's a chap called Professor F.F. Bruce from the University of Manchester. He puts it like this: some writers may toy with the fancy of a Christ myth, but they do so not on historical grounds. This is my worst word of the morning. The historicity of Christ is as axiomatic, which just means self-evident, for an unbiased historian as the historicity of Julius Caesar. Christ myth theories are not propagated by historians. A fellow historian, Professor Otto Betz, concluded in a similar way: no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus. I'm getting better at that word. Ultimately, when returning to that question of why should we have our confidence in Jesus, the historical writings are just so well documented. They document his life and influence. They document the whole story of the early church, so the first Christians that walked and planted churches and saw that go across eventually the whole Roman Empire. And then as you follow that early church, you can literally follow the story of that to us here today. These should give us a great sense of confidence that not only are we Christian, but there have literally been billions of Christ followers who went before us. According to Wiki, this was my factoid of the week. If you're ever in a pub quiz and this comes up, probably won't, there are more people who are alive today across the world who would identify as being Christian compared with those who would identify as being atheist or secular, of no religion. And it's about double the amount. It's a huge difference. So, back to the points to ponder. One little moment just for you to ponder again. What is the one reason why you have confidence in Jesus? Not for someone else, but for you. What is the one reason you can think of today, this morning, that you could share with your neighbour sat next to you, of why you have confidence in Jesus? I'll just give you another couple of minutes to chat with your neighbour. Thank you. I hope that helps. There's a nice buzz around the room. So the story that Jay kindly read to us earlier was Peter's moment of learning what confidence in Jesus looked like. Literally, he started to drown as his confidence waned. Peter's pattern of confidence is quite similar to my own life. I get inspired by the Lord and say, yes, Lord, I'll do this for you. And then you start doing it, and then you realize it's harder than it looked or harder than you thought it would be when you started it, and you start sinking, metaphorically, or maybe practically, if you're doing what Peter did. And then eventually, once you realize you're sinking, you might actually ask, this is what I eventually do, ask Jesus for some help in that. And then finally, Jesus helps, the thing gets done, and I realized that if I'd have just had more faith in the middle of that journey, it would have probably been all right all along. So please don't ever read Peter's walking on water story as a story of failure. It wasn't. For Peter, it was his opportunity to learn how to trust, to learn how to have confidence in Jesus. The Peter that started to sink, you've got to remember, was the one that Jesus built his church on. Literally, Peter was eventually martyred in Rome by the Emperor Nero, but his legacy stands as the rock on which Jesus built the church. But that was Peter. What does that look like more like today? And at this point, when I was preparing the sermon, I was thinking, actually, what I really want to do is list all the charities that you and I see on a daily, weekly, monthly basis and talk about where their Christian origins come from, because most of them do. And then I thought, actually, that's a really long list. It's almost quicker if I'd have just told you the charities that don't have a Christian input. But I thought, actually, let's just keep it shorter and simple. And I just want to bring you back to a story of two Christians around the 1780s who eventually allowed us to meet here today. They also paved the way for your children, and for some of you, maybe your grandchildren, to go to school. You've got to remember, if you put yourself back in, if you ever did GCSE history, put yourself back in the mid-1700s, there was no restriction at that point as to when your children could work, or how long they could work for, or how many days they could work for. So it was just, while they were awake, you could literally make them work. It seems really bizarre now, doesn't it? But that was how it worked. If you were born male and upper class or upper middle class, you might have gone to school, you might have been educated. If you weren't one of those two things, you probably wouldn't have been educated unless your parents were well off enough to pay for your education at home, if you were a lady. And if you weren't any of those, you probably wouldn't have been able to read or write. So it was relatively normative in churches in those days that most of the congregation wouldn't be able to read or write. It's crazy. It's crazy for us to think that now. Then there was a chap in Gloucestershire called William King. He started a Sunday school in 1781. Important date, 1781. His friend was Robert Raikes, who is largely the one that is ever attributed with the start of the Sunday school movement. Robert Raikes, easy for me to say, loved the idea of a Sunday school, and he saw a specific need. His thing was about poverty, and particularly making sure that kids didn't get into crime. You could see that this, if they literally don't have enough to eat, they'll end up in a life of crime. It's really simple. He wasn't a vicar. He was the editor of the Gloucester Journal, and he set about using his influence as a journalist promoting Sunday schools, locally initially, then nationally. Obviously, it became a thing that became international. In 1784, so this is 3 years after, not necessarily the first one, but the first one we're talking about, the one that William King started, John Wesley was at his peak. He wrote in one of his letters, "I find these Sunday schools springing up wherever I go. Perhaps God may have a deeper end therein than man is aware of." I should say, for those of you who've never grown up in a Methodist church, John Wesley was the chap that started Methodism. He literally travelled the length and breadth of this country on a horse and shared the gospel with anyone who could hear it, would listen to it. So essentially, as the Methodist revival swept this country, it carried with it that this belief that we should, as Christians, make the lives of these children better. Ultimately, those children would go along to the meetings, not being able to read or write, and through the Sunday school, they would be shown how to read or write for the first time. And included within that, obviously, they were taught the Bible, again, for the first time. So by 1802, this is only 21 years after the first Sunday school that I'm telling you about. There was a Sunday school before that, maybe a few decades before that just didn't catch on. These were the two that caught on. So 21 years later, 1802, the movement had had such an impact that the law was changed to limit your kids were like this, to limit children's working hours to 12 hours a day. Exactly, and the response says it all. You know, if we are asked to work 12 hours a day, we'd be like, really? How much are you going to pay me for that? But our kids, can you imagine them going out to work 12 hours a day? And that was like a new limit that was set, because it was fair game to make them work many more hours than that prior to that. 30 years after that, 1831 we are now. So 50 years after the point at which Robert Raikes started raising the profile of Sunday schools. In this country alone, 1.25 million kids went to Sunday schools. That's about 25% of the eligible population at the time. By 1870, this is the turning moment. 1870, the Elementary Education Act brought in compulsory education for all children. Compulsory education for all children, just in case you missed it because Pat was coughing. Over the next 10 years, so that's only like 90 years after Robert Raikes started his campaign. Over the 10 years from that moment onwards, 4,000 schools were started in this country. One man's confidence in Jesus and that sense of, I want life to be better for the kids that come into our Methodist meetings, one man's confidence in Jesus changed not only the generations of kids after him, but it changed the lives of our kids now, and indeed our education. I grew up in a northern mill town, it was back in those days. If I'd have grown up then without the 1870 Elementary Education Act, I'd have worked in one of those mills. It's bizarre to think that, isn't it? I wouldn't be stood here today because I wouldn't be able to read my notes because I wouldn't have been able to write them in the first place. How bizarre. We went to visit the Causeway Coast Vineyard a few years ago, which was lovely. They were in Northern Ireland. They refer to their teaching staff, their teachers within their congregation, as kingdom ninjas. It's a great descriptive because it's the unseen ability to shape the next generation of doctors, politicians, writers, teachers, business people, parents, preachers, and pioneers. There was a great advert, probably when I was a kid, that said, it was an advert to get into teaching, it said, you never forget a good teacher. And it made me think, when I was 11, I was in a village junior school taught by Mr. Greenhalgh. There were 13 of us in that year, and those 13 kids knew that if the British government got us involved, we would sort out poverty in this nation. We would. We knew it. We were inspired by a good teacher. He was a kingdom ninja for me. Sadly, we never got the invite. The British government never got us involved, and we've still got poverty in the nation. But, we've got time yet. So, in 1781, how do you think Robert Raikes felt about starting his campaign to introduce Sunday schools to educate in a free way the kids that came along to the churches? you've got to remember at that time, nobody could think of how the country would run if we took out that cheap labour force of the kids from the factories across the nation. But it does. It works. We took them out. They get educated now. And our country has changed along with it. And we meet here today in a school that provides, I know we're a tax-paying nation, but it provides free education. I don't pay extra for my kids to come to this school. Robert Raikes had a confidence in Jesus that changed the destiny of millions of children in this country alone. Free education for children is now seen as the norm in a developed country, so it became a worldwide movement. Both John Wesley and Robert Raikes had something in common. Their confidence in Jesus led to two things. It led to a passion to draw other people into that relationship with Jesus. They were natural networkers, and they would invite anyone and everyone who would listen to them. And they also had a passion to see God's kingdom come in a very practical way. We talk about here, we've always tagged, if you follow us on social media, when we've gone out and done something that brings a blessing to our community, we'll often tag it and just say, blessed to be a blessing, just one word. And that's exactly what John Wesley and Robert Raikes did across that time period. And it changed our country, and it changed the whole education system across the world. So last points to ponder. Can you think, like with Robert Raikes, can you think of one person, just one person, that you would like to share your confidence in Jesus with, who's not in this room? Maybe it's a work colleague. Maybe it's someone a neighbour. Maybe it's a friend or a family member. And then the second point of this, just for you to ponder, we're hoping to run an alpha course again in January, in the next term. That one person that you will share your confidence with Jesus in, I'm just wondering whether you might invite them along to Alpha. And I'm just wondering whether you might pray for them from now until we start our Alpha course. It's not quite as world-changing as putting in a free education service for all. But you never know. Somebody had to tell Robert Raikes about Jesus. Somebody had to share their confidence in Jesus with Robert Raikes. And that difference was worth it for all of us. So I'm just going to give you another couple of minutes just to turn around to the person next to you, near you, and just share those two things. Is there somebody you can think of that you would like to share your confidence in Jesus with? And would you commit to praying for them until we start our next Alpha course? Go. Thank you. Well done. I hope you've thought of somebody. I did, and I feel quite challenged by the person I thought of, but there you go. Worship team, would you like to come back up? We've got a few songs of worship now, and then we'll pray for each other at the end. So would you like to stand again? And actually, I'm just going to pray for us again. We don't normally pray at this point in the service, but do stand up, do stand up. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to pray for our friends, neighbours, relations. And Lord, I just pray as we worship you now this morning, you will become as real to us as the person standing next to us. May you fill us with the confidence that your plan for our life and the life of our friend that we're praying for is important.